Imagine a pit bull, pregnant and injured, left with no hope. With a broken leg and a belly full of life, she crawls to a stranger's door, desperate for help. What happened next changed everything. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to help us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. It was one of those nights where everything felt heavier. Clouds hung low in the sky, and the air was thick with the promise of rain. James Walker sat in his worn recliner, the flickering glow of his old TV casting shadows across the walls of his modest suburban home. He took a sip of coffee, staring blankly at the screen. Since retiring from the military, nights like these had become his routine, quiet, solitary, and uneventful. But that night would be different. As he reached for the remote to change the channel, a sound caught his attention. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the soft rumble of distant thunder. He paused, listening intently. There it was again, a low, desperate whimper. James furrowed his brow. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the usual rustle of neighborhood cats rummaging through trash. It was something else, something in pain. He set his coffee down and moved toward the window, pulling aside the curtain. The rain had begun to fall, light but steady, making the street glisten under the dim glow of the streetlights. At first he saw nothing, but then movement caught his eye. A dark shape, low to the ground, inching its way toward his front yard. James squinted, his heart beginning to race. He could just make out the shape of a dog dragging itself forward, one agonizing inch at a time. Without a second thought, James grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, the cold rain soaking through his clothes almost instantly. The whimpering grew louder as he approached the figure. What he saw made his stomach drop. It was a pit bull, her fur matted with mud and rain, her body thin and frail. One of her legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and her belly was swollen. Pregnant. She was trying to crawl, her injured leg dragging uselessly behind her, her eyes wide with pain and desperation. James knelt down, his hands trembling. "Hey there, girl," he said softly, his voice breaking. "What happened to you?" The dog froze, her body tensing as if expecting another blow. Her eyes locked onto his, and in them, James saw something that hit him harder than any storm ever could, a plea for help. She didn't growl or snap. She simply stared at him, her chest heaving with labored breaths. "It's okay," James whispered, reaching out cautiously. "I'm not going to hurt you." Slowly he placed his hand on her head, feeling the cold, wet fur beneath his fingers. The dog let out a soft whimper, but didn't pull away. She was too weak to resist, too tired to fight. James glanced at her leg, wincing at the sight of the injury. It wasn't just broken. It was swollen and bleeding, a clear sign of how long she'd been suffering. And yet, even in her condition, she had dragged herself to his door, as if she knew he was her only hope. Gently, James slid his arms beneath her, lifting her off the ground. She let out a small yelp of pain, but then rested her head against his chest, her body limp with exhaustion. "You're okay now," he murmured, holding her close. The rain continued to fall as he carried her inside, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he was going to do or how he was going to help her, but one thing was certain: he couldn't turn his back on her. Inside the house, James carefully laid the dog on a blanket by the fireplace. She shivered despite the warmth, her breaths shallow and uneven. He quickly grabbed another blanket, wrapping it around her, and then ran to the kitchen to grab a bowl of water. When he returned, she lifted her head weakly, her tongue flicking out to lap at the water. It was a small sign of life, but it gave James a glimmer of hope. As he sat beside her, stroking her head gently, James felt a surge of anger. Who could do this to an animal? The broken leg, the emaciated frame. It was clear she had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in a world that had been anything but kind. And yet, despite everything, she had fought to survive. She had crawled through the rain, through the pain, to find someone who might help her. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" James said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how you made it this far, but I promise you, I won't let you down. The dog closed her eyes, her body finally relaxing, as if she understood his words. James stayed with her through the night, listening to the rain outside and the soft sound of her breathing. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, he knew one thing. He had found his purpose again. The fight to save her had just begun. As dawn broke, the soft light of morning illuminated the small living room where James had spent the night on the floor beside the injured pit bull. She lay curled in the blanket he had wrapped around her, her breaths shallow but steady. James hadn't slept a wink. Every time she stirred, he had reached out to comfort her, whispering softly, "You're safe now, girl. Just hang on." The night's storm had passed, but a new storm brewed within James. He couldn't shake the image of her crawling through the rain, dragging her broken body to his door. It wasn't just the injury that haunted him. It was the clear evidence of neglect and cruelty. Her ribs jutted sharply against her thin coat, and her swollen belly told a story of hardship. Pregnant, injured, and alone, she had been abandoned at the most vulnerable moment of her life. James gently touched her head, and her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she looked at him, her gaze soft, but filled with exhaustion. "Good morning, girl," he said, his voice hoarse. "We've got to get you some help." He didn't own a car. Since retiring, he had sold it to save money, relying on his bike or walking to get around. But walking wasn't an option today. He grabbed his phone and called the one person he knew who could help, Dr. Emily Clark, a local veterinarian who had been his friend since high school. "Emily, I need you," he said urgently when she answered. "I found a dog. She's in bad shape. Pregnant, broken leg, malnourished. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end before Emily's voice came through, steady and calm. "Bring her in, James. I'll open the clinic early. Can you get here?" "I'll find a way," he replied, glancing at the dog, who had closed her eyes again. "Just be ready." James hung up and looked around the room, his mind racing. He spotted an old wooden crate he had used for storage and quickly emptied it. Lining it with another blanket, he fashioned a makeshift carrier. "This will have to do," he muttered. Carefully, he lifted the dog into the crate. She whimpered softly, her broken leg shifting despite his efforts to be gentle. "I know, girl, I know," he said, his heart aching. "I'm so sorry, but we've got to get you to the doctor." James loaded the crate onto his bicycle, securing it with bungee cords. The setup wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could manage. As he pedaled toward the clinic, every bump in the road sent a pang of guilt through him. The dog's soft whimpers cut through the early morning quiet, urging him to go faster. The ride was grueling. James wasn't as strong as he used to be, and the added weight of the crate made every pedal stroke a struggle. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool morning air, and his legs burned with exertion. But he didn't stop, not for a second. When he finally reached the clinic, Emily was waiting at the door, her expression shifting from concern to shock as she saw the state of the dog in the crate. "Oh, James," she breathed, quickly opening the door and helping him carry the crate inside. Emily wasted no time, examining the dog with practiced hands, while James stood nearby, his fists clenched and jaw tight. "It's bad, isn't it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emily nodded grimly. "Her leg is broken in multiple places. It looks like it's been this way for days, maybe even weeks. She's severely malnourished, and being pregnant in this condition is putting a huge strain on her body. She's dehydrated, too. James, I don't know how she's still alive." James swallowed hard, his throat tight. "She crawled to my door," he said quietly, "through the rain, with a broken leg, just to get help. She's a fighter, Emily. You've got to do everything you can." Emily met his gaze. Her own eyes filled with determination. "I'll do my best. But James, this won't be easy or cheap. She's going to need surgery for the leg, intensive care, and possibly a cesarean if she can't deliver the puppies on her own." "Whatever it takes," James said firmly. "I'll figure it out. Just save her." Emily nodded and got to work, administering fluids and pain medication to stabilize the dog. James stayed by her side the entire time, stroking her head and whispering words of encouragement. "You've made it this far," he told her. "Don't give up now." Hours passed, and the dog's condition began to stabilize. She was weak but responsive, her eyes following James whenever he moved. Emily took X-rays of her leg and confirmed what they feared. The break was severe and would require immediate surgery to prevent permanent damage, or worse. As the day wore on, James couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility for the dog. She had chosen him, crawled to his door in her moment of greatest need. He didn't know how he would pay for the treatment, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let her down. By the time Emily prepared the operating room for surgery, James had already made up his mind. This dog wasn't just a stray anymore. She was his responsibility, and he would do whatever it took to give her and her unborn puppies a chance at life. Chapter 3. Small progress, big setbacks. The next morning, James sat in the waiting area of the clinic, his heart pounding as he watched the clock tick forward. He had spent the night pacing the small room, unable to shake the memory of the injured pit bull's eyes, the sheer determination and pain they had carried. Her strength, even in her broken state, was unlike anything he had ever seen. Now, her life hung in the balance. In the operating room, Dr. Emily worked with precision. The dog's leg was more damaged than she had initially thought. The fracture had set poorly, and there were signs of infection creeping into the tissue. Emily muttered under her breath, her gloved hands carefully cleaning and stabilizing the injury. "Come on, girl," she whispered. "You've made it this far. Don't give up now." After what felt like an eternity, Emily finally emerged from the operating room. James jumped to his feet, searching her face for any sign of good news. She pulled down her mask and let out a tired sigh. "The surgery went as well as it could," she said. "Her leg is stabilized, but the infection was worse than I expected. She's going to need antibiotics and close monitoring. The next 48 hours are critical." James nodded, his throat tight. "What about the puppies?" Emily hesitated. "They're hanging on, but the stress on her body is significant. We'll need to keep her calm and well-fed to give them a fighting chance. James, I won't lie to you. This is going to be a long road." James glanced toward the recovery room, where the dog lay under a blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. "She's not giving up," he said quietly. "Neither am I." The days that followed were a blur of care and worry. James spent every spare moment at the clinic, sitting beside the dog's kennel and speaking to her in soft tones. He had started calling her Hope, a name that felt fitting for a creature who had endured so much, yet refused to give in. Hope's recovery was slow. She remained weak, her body trembling with even the smallest movements. James fed her by hand, coaxing her to eat small bites of soft food. "You've got to eat, girl," he said one evening, holding a piece of chicken close to her mouth. "Your babies are counting on you." Hope looked at him with tired eyes, then slowly began to chew. It was a small victory, but it filled James with a flicker of hope. However, not all the news was good. The infection in Hope's leg lingered, and her condition seemed to improve one day, only to worsen the next. Emily expressed concern over her ability to carry the puppies to term. "She's fighting so hard, James," Emily said during one of their late-night conversations. "But her body is fragile. If she goes into labor now, I don't know if she'll make it." James clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. "She's come too far for this," he said. "There has to be something we can do." Emily shook her head gently. "We're doing everything we can. The rest is up to her." One evening, as James sat beside Hope, he felt a new kind of helplessness settle over him. The clinic bills were piling up, and his savings were rapidly depleting. He had sold a few old tools and even pawned his grandfather's watch, but it wasn't enough. The thought of failing Hope because of money made his stomach churn. Desperate, James turned to social media. He posted photos of Hope and her story, pouring his heart into the words. This brave girl crawled to my door with a broken leg and a belly full of puppies. She's fighting for her life, and I'm fighting with her. If you can help, even a little, it would mean the world to us. He didn't expect much, but within hours the post began to gain traction. Comments and messages poured in, strangers offering words of encouragement, small donations, and even supplies. One woman wrote, "Pit bulls have the biggest hearts. Thank you for giving her a chance. I'm sending $50 for her care." Another added, "You're doing something incredible. Don't give up." The outpouring of support overwhelmed James. It wasn't just the money. It was the kindness, the understanding, the proof that people cared. He printed out a photo of Hope and her story, pinning it to the clinic's bulletin board with the words, "Thank you," scrawled across the top. Despite the small victories, setbacks continued to haunt them. One night, Hope began to whimper softly in her kennel, her body trembling. James rushed to her side, panic tightening his chest. "Emily!" he called, his voice sharp with fear. Emily hurried into the room, her face tense as she examined Hope. "She's in distress," she said. "It might be early labor." James felt his heart drop. "But it's too soon," he said. "She's not strong enough." Emily nodded grimly. "I know, but we don't have a choice. If she's going into labor, we need to act fast." James knelt beside Hope, stroking her head as her breathing grew more labored. "You're strong, girl," he whispered. "You've got this. I'm right here." As the night stretched on, James prayed silently, willing Hope to hold on. He had seen resilience in her eyes before, and he clung to the belief that she could make it through this. But deep down, he knew the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. The air in the clinic was heavy with tension as the first contractions rippled through Hope's fragile body. James knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on her head, feeling the tremors coursing through her. Her whimpers were soft but heart-wrenching, a painful reminder of how fragile her condition was. He looked at Dr. Emily, who was busy preparing the sterile equipment nearby. "Can she do this?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper, fear evident in his tone. Emily glanced at him, her face etched with concern. "We're about to find out," she replied. "But it's going to take everything she has, and then some." James nodded, swallowing hard as he turned his attention back to Hope. Her eyes met his, and for a moment it was as if she was pleading with him to stay by her side. "I'm not going anywhere, girl," he murmured. "You're not alone." The hours crawled by as Hope fought to bring her puppies into the world. Each contraction seemed to drain her, her body trembling from the effort. Emily monitored her closely, her hands steady as she assisted with the delivery. The first puppy arrived, a tiny wet bundle of fur. Emily quickly cleaned it and placed it in a warm towel before holding it up to James. "Alive," she said with a small smile. "One down." James let out a shaky breath, tears welling up in his eyes. He watched as the puppy let out a faint squeak, its tiny chest rising and falling. It was a glimmer of hope in what had felt like an endless storm, but the fight was far from over. Hope's body was weak, and with each successive birth, the strain on her grew. By the time the third puppy arrived, her breathing had become labored, and she barely had the strength to lift her head. "She's fading," Emily said, her voice tight. "James, talk to her. Keep her with us." James leaned closer, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Hope, listen to me. You've made it this far. You're the strongest dog I've ever known. Those babies need you. I need you. Please don't give up now." For a moment it seemed as if his words reached her, Hope let out a low, determined growl, her body trembling as another contraction hit. Emily worked quickly, delivering the fourth and fifth puppies, both alive and squirming. The room filled with the soft cries of new life, a sound that should have been joyful, but was overshadowed by the sight of Hope collapsing onto the blanket. "She's in trouble," Emily said urgently. "Her heart rate is dropping." James felt panic grip him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice shaking. Emily moved swiftly, administering medication to stabilize Hope. "We've done everything we can," she said. "Now it's up to her." James knelt beside Hope, tears streaming down his face. He stroked her head, his voice trembling. "You've been through so much, girl. Don't let this be the end. Those little ones need their mom." Hope's breathing was shallow, her body limp. For a moment, it seemed like she might slip away, and James felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. But then, her eyes fluttered open. She let out a weak whine, her gaze shifting to the tiny puppies nestled in the blanket beside her. James followed her gaze and saw something remarkable, a spark of determination. "She's not giving up," James said, hope rising in his chest. "Look at her. She's still fighting." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "She's one tough dog," she said. "Let's give her some time." The hours that followed were agonizingly slow. James stayed by Hope's side, watching every rise and fall of her chest. He spoke to her constantly, telling her stories about the life he imagined for her and her puppies. He promised her a future filled with love and safety, a world where she would never have to suffer again. Slowly, Hope began to regain her strength. She nuzzled the puppies, her maternal instincts taking over as she cleaned them with gentle licks. James watched in awe, his heart swelling with pride and relief. She had done it. Against all odds, she had brought 5 healthy puppies into the world and survived. "She's amazing," Emily said quietly, watching the scene unfold. "You were right to name her Hope." James smiled, wiping his eyes. "She's more than amazing. She's a miracle." As night fell, the clinic grew quiet. The puppies were bundled together in a warm box beside Hope, their tiny bodies rising and falling in unison. James sat beside her, his hand resting on her head as she dozed off. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Hope's survival, but for the way she had reignited something in him. Her fight had reminded him of the strength he thought he had lost. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, girl." Hope let out a soft sigh, her body relaxing into sleep. For the first time in a long time, James felt at peace. The next morning, sunlight poured through the clinic windows, casting a warm glow over the recovery room. Hope lay on her side, her puppies nestled against her, their tiny bodies squirming as they nursed. James sat in a chair beside her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but filled with relief. He couldn't take his gaze off the little family, proof of the resilience he had witnessed over the past few days. Emily walked into the room holding a clipboard and a cup of coffee. "How's she doing?" she asked, her voice soft. James glanced up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She's incredible," he said. "She's tired, but she hasn't stopped taking care of them." Emily nodded, stepping closer to examine Hope. She carefully lifted her paw, checking her vitals and the healing leg. "She's a fighter, that's for sure," she said. "But there's something you should know." James straightened in his chair, his smile fading. "What is it?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then handed him a folder. "When we took x-rays of her leg, we also did a full-body scan to check for any internal injuries. That's when I noticed something unusual." She paused, meeting his gaze. "There are scars all over her body, older ones. Some are from fights. Others, they're from deliberate harm." James felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over him. "Are you saying she was abused?" Emily nodded solemnly. "It's almost certain. Someone used her, James, likely for breeding or worse. And when she became too much trouble, pregnant and injured, they tossed her aside." James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. The image of Hope crawling through the rain, desperate and broken, replayed in his mind. He couldn't fathom how anyone could be so cruel. But then he looked at her, lying peacefully with her puppies, and felt a surge of determination. "She's not a victim anymore," he said firmly. "She's safe now. And I'm going to make sure she never suffers like that again." Emily gave him a small smile. "I've contacted a few rescue organizations to help with the puppies once they're ready for adoption. But Hope, she's going to need a lot of care, James. Physical therapy for her leg, regular checkups, and time to heal emotionally." James didn't hesitate. "I'm keeping her," he said. "She came to my door for a reason. I'm not letting her go." Over the next few weeks, James devoted himself to Hope's recovery. He transformed his small home into a sanctuary, creating a cozy corner with blankets and toys for her and the puppies. He spent hours bottle-feeding the smallest of the litter, who struggled to keep up with his stronger siblings. Each day brought new challenges, but James faced them with unwavering resolve. Hope, too, began to transform. The fear in her eyes gradually gave way to trust. She followed James around the house, her tail wagging weakly but steadily. She began to play with her puppies, her maternal instincts shining through despite her lingering pain. The puppies were a constant source of joy. James gave them temporary names: Lucky, Scout, Daisy, Patch, and Tiny, and marveled at their unique personalities. Lucky was the boldest, always the first to explore new territory, while Tiny, the runt, was content to stay close to his mother. Watching them grow filled James with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as James sat on the porch with Hope lying beside him, her head resting on his lap, he found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. Before Hope, his days had been empty, filled with routine but lacking meaning. Now, every moment felt significant. Her fight for survival had reminded him of his own battles, of the strength it took to keep going when the odds were stacked against you. "You saved me, you know," he said softly, scratching behind her ears. Hope let out a contented sigh, her eyes closing as if she understood. "I thought I was helping you, but really, you gave me something to fight for again." As the stars began to dot the sky, James felt a rare sense of peace settle over him. He had lost so much in his life, but Hope had filled a void he hadn't realized was there. She had come to him broken, yet she had brought healing, not just to herself, but to him as well. The next morning, James received a call from Emily. "I have some good news," she said. "The local news station wants to do a story on Hope. They saw the post you made online, and they think her journey could inspire people." James hesitated. He wasn't one for attention, but he realized this wasn't about him. It was about hope, about showing the world what resilience looked like, and about challenging the stigma that surrounded pit bulls. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it." The news crew arrived later that week, filming Hope and her puppies as they played in the yard. James shared their story, his voice steady but emotional as he recounted the night she crawled to his door. "She didn't just ask for help," he said. "She demanded it. She showed me what it means to fight for life, even when everything seems hopeless." The segment aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from viewers who were moved by Hope's story, many sharing their own tales of rescue and redemption. Donations to local animal shelters spiked, and several families expressed interest in adopting the puppies when they were ready. As James sat with Hope that night, the two of them watching the puppies tumble over each other in the living room, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Hope had been through hell, but she had come out the other side stronger. and in doing so, she had brought him back to life, too. "You're more than just hope," he said, stroking her head. "You're a miracle." In the weeks that followed the news broadcast, Hope's story continued to touch lives far and wide. Donations flooded in to cover her medical bills, and the interest in adopting her puppies was overwhelming. The tiny pit bulls grew stronger each day, their playful antics filling James's home with joy and laughter. Hope, too, began to heal, not just physically but emotionally. She walked more confidently now, her once timid eyes shining with trust whenever James was near. James built a daily routine around their care, taking Hope on gentle walks to strengthen her leg and playing with the puppies as they tumbled over each other. Every day brought new milestones: Hope wagging her tail, a puppy learning to climb the porch steps, and with each one, James felt more whole. When the day came for the puppies to leave for their new homes, James felt a pang of sadness, but knew it was the right decision. Each family who came to adopt a puppy had followed Hope's journey and promised to give her little ones the love and care they deserved. Only Tiny stayed behind, his bond with Hope too strong to break. As James watched Hope nuzzle Tiny, he realized how far they had come together. From the rain-soaked night when she had crawled to his door to this moment of peace and promise, their journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. Hope had taught him what it meant to fight for love, for life, and for second chances. Hope's story is more than a tale of survival. It's a reminder of the power of resilience, compassion, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, consider how you can make a difference. There are countless animals like Hope out there, injured, abandoned, and waiting for someone to believe in them. By subscribing to this channel, liking this video, and sharing it with your friends, you help us bring stories like Hope's to the world. But it doesn't stop there. Visit your local shelters, volunteer, donate, or even adopt. You could be the person who changes a life, and in doing so, find your own life transformed. Together we can show the world that every life, no matter how broken, is worth saving. Thank you for watching, and don't forget, courage and kindness can overcome any challenge. Hope did it, and so can we.